Hello, back again on the Top Recap channel. This time I will tell a movie's entitled Flight Risk. Let's get straight into the storyline. The story begins by showing a man named Winston, who is at home and looks very nervous. Suddenly, he is surprised by the arrival of two policemen, and Winston is immediately handcuffed. Then, a beautiful policewoman named Madeline arrives. She looked very happy because she had finally caught the person she had been looking for. Winston asks for a deal with Madeline and begs for legal protection. Madeline calls the headquarters and tells them that Winston has been arrested, but he asks for a deal.
It's Harris. Yep. Clean capture. Listen, he wants to make a deal.
Had his shoes in his pocket.
Kite with seatbelts. Honestly, I'd rather be on Spirit Airlines.
3 days later, it appeared that Madeline would take Winston to court. They traveled in a small plane and took off with a pilot named Daryl. Before takeoff, Madeline calls her director, Van Sant, and informs her that Winston has not provided any information while in custody.
Deputy Harris? Daryl Booth.
Soon, Daryl arrives and immediately tells Madeline and Winston to get ready. Daryl asked if Madeline was sure she didn't want to sit in the back to watch Winston. However, Madeline replied that Winston was handcuffed, so there was no need to worry.
You sure you don't want to ride in the back there with him?
Before takeoff, Daryl said that he had never flown with a fugitive. Suddenly, Winston denied it and said he was not a fugitive, but a witness cooperating with the government. Madeline, annoyed that Winston kept talking, finally told him to shut up. She also asked Daryl not to talk to Winston.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Finally, they took off. But not long after they flew, the plane suddenly experienced turbulence. Madeline asked Daryl whether his plane always experienced turbulence. Daryl told her to wear a communication device, and Madeline finally put on headphones. However, she was surprised that Daryl played a song to ease her fear on the plane.
Not digging the music?
Meanwhile, Winston, who wasn't using a communication device, had trouble calling Daryl and Madeline. He also tried to grab the headphones in front of him, but since his hands were handcuffed, of course, he had trouble.
Yeah, ain't the same, huh?
Come on.
Why is he in chains?
Madeline accidentally saw the wound on Daryl's neck and asked, "Is your neck okay?" Daryl replied, "Yeah, it's okay. It was just an accident at work." However, when he saw Winston in chains, Daryl asked Madeline because Winston mentioned they were both on the same side. Madeline then explains that Winston has a fear of flying, or aerophobia. Madeline also reminded Daryl not to believe Winston's words easily. Suddenly, the plane they were traveling on experienced signal interference and lost its GPS. Daryl tried calming Madeline down by saying he had experience flying the route. Daryl said that the flight to Seattle would take about 75 minutes. However, Madeline, who was very worried, requested that the flight be cancelled. Daryl explained that if they returned, they would likely be held up for several hours due to bad weather. He also assured Madeline that he would drive them safely as Daryl had memorized the route. Hearing that, Madeline became suspicious of Daryl, as she had not told him their destination, but Daryl already knew it. Suddenly, they were startled by a bird crashing into the plane. Daryl immediately raised the flying altitude so that no more birds would hit. Meanwhile, Winston was curious about something that looked like a flight license. He tried to pick up the letter using his foot. It turns out that it's Daryl's flight license, but the photo is different.
Oh, shit.
Instantly, Winston tries to call Madeline to tell her that the pilot is not the real Daryl. So that Daryl wouldn't get suspicious, Winston pretended that he had dropped the item and asked Madeline to pick it up. Madeline, who thought Winston was just scared of flying, immediately calmed Winston and said everything would be fine.
I don't care, Winston. Suck it up.
No, it's like I feel really bad. Like I got a bad...
Daryl asked what happened to Winston, and Madeline replied that Winston wanted to vomit. Hearing that, Daryl immediately gave Winston a vomit bag. As Daryl was about to give the bag, Madeline accidentally saw blood on Daryl's shirt. She began to think that Winston actually wanted to tell her something. Madeline is increasingly suspicious of Daryl because she previously saw Daryl's neck injured and now sees blood on his shirt. Madeline then asked how Daryl knew her destination, even though she hadn't told him. Daryl casually replied that he thought Madeline was not Alaskan, so she would most likely fly to Seattle. Madeline, still suspicious, then asked Daryl to contact the ATC, Air Traffic Controller Tower, via radio. Daryl immediately tried to contact ATC, but the plane's route through the mountains blocked the signal, and as a result, they failed to contact ATC. After that, Madeline tried to trap Daryl by saying she flew with a pilot named Janikowski last week. Confidently, Daryl replied that he had flown with Janikowski and left with nitrogen and a welding torch some time ago.
Janikowski? Oh, sure. Great guy.
Hearing that, Madeline immediately replied that the pilot who drove her at that time was a woman.
Except she's a woman.
That's when Madeline realized Daryl was not the pilot assigned to escort her. She immediately took a gun and pointed it at Daryl. However, the vigilant Daryl immediately fought Madeline. Daryl managed to throw Madeline's gun, then took a knife and threatened to keep Madeline calm, assuring her that he would not kill her. But suddenly, Madeline bit Daryl's hand until the knife he was holding was thrown away, and they fought again. But in the end, Daryl managed to hit Madeline until she fainted.
What the? You wanna play rough?
Daryl then tells Winston that his boss, Moretti, is furious and wants Winston killed. Terrified, Winston tries to convince Daryl that he never gave any information to the police. In a panic, Winston offers Daryl $1 million worth of crypto, provided he is not killed. However, Daryl is not interested in the offer, especially since he doesn't understand crypto either.
Whatever, hell, what does it matter? We're talking about $1 million here.
Winston then explains that Moretti had a lot of money and distributed it to many people. One of the recipients was a man living in Sankaty who received $25,000 monthly.
This one guy in Sankaty, Massachusetts got $25,000 a month for years.
Winston tries to persuade Daryl, but Daryl still doesn't want to accept the offer because he doesn't want to betray Moretti. Because Winston continues to babble, Daryl immediately slaps him. From there, it was revealed that Winston was an accountant who had been embezzling Moretti's money and had bribed someone so that Moretti's crimes would not be exposed. After that, Daryl prepares to finish off Madeline. However, Madeline suddenly woke up and immediately shocked Daryl until he fainted. Seeing that, Winston panicked even more. Madeline tries to calm him down, but Daryl suddenly wakes up and immediately attacks them. The fight resumed until Madeline finally managed to shock Daryl again. However, because Daryl kept pushing Madeline, he accidentally pressed the aircraft lever, making the plane dive sharply.
You're all gonna die! Pull him on the end of the pull him up!
Madeline immediately pulled the aircraft's steering lever until it stabilized. She then activated the autopilot mode. After that, she tried to open the handcuffs but found it difficult. Winston offered to help. Madeline, traumatized by being lied to by Daryl, initially refused Winston's help. However, due to the difficulty, she finally asks Winston to help her.
You got trust issues, lady.
Madeline and Winston are confused because they can't fly the plane while Daryl is still unconscious. Madeline then looks for something in Daryl's pocket and finds a photo of Daryl's murder target. As it turns out, not only Madeline and Winston were targeted, but also Winston's mother. Winston panics when he hears that his mother is in danger. Madeline asks Winston to stay calm and focused, as there is nothing they can do before they land. After that, Madeline requested that Winston help her move Daryl to the back and handcuff him.
That's that grab handle there.
Winston then asked if he could sit next to Madeline. Then, Madeline asked how Winston knew about Daryl, and Winston showed her the flying license he found under the chair. Not just silent, Madeline tried to call for help and managed to connect. She then reported the aircraft's altitude and location. However, flying over the mountains instantly disrupted their signal, and the call was cut off.
Help! I need help. 3,000 feet.
Okay, you're a little low.
All I see is mountains. Can you say again?
I said...
Damn it, come on. Hello? Hello?
Winston said that a pilot should report the situation, and Madeline remembered that she should have called using a satellite phone. Finally, Madeline connected with Van Sant. She told her about what was going on. Van Sant was asked to send help immediately, and also send officers to Winston's mum's house.
Compromised. The pilot wasn't who he says he was. He's one of Moretti. Officers over to Winston's mother's house, okay? She may be in danger.
Okay. All right. Don't worry. We're on it. I will call you back.
Okay.
Surprisingly, Daryl regained consciousness and suddenly laughed when he heard Madeline, who needed a pilot. Madeline asked Daryl to show her how to fly a plane, but Daryl refused and joked instead. Suddenly, Madeline immediately pointed a gun and prepared to shoot Daryl. However, Daryl warned that if Madeline shot him, the bullet would penetrate the aircraft's fuel tank and cause an explosion.
Line that a fuel tank is, he could put a hole in it.
Shortly afterwards, Madeline was contacted by a pilot named Hassan, who directed her to fly the aircraft. Hassan asked Madeline to tell him the aircraft's altitude and airspeed. However, in a state of panic, Hassan joked and teased Madeline. Surprisingly, this made Madeline a little calmer.
Ready? You're just going to ease that yoke to the left.
Hassan then directed Madeline to slowly pull the aircraft's cockpit to the left, and then slightly pull it again before steering the aircraft to the southeast. Eventually, Madeline managed to stabilize the aircraft.
We're good.
I have no doubt.
Meanwhile, Daryl continued to try to remove his handcuffs, but failed. However, Daryl gets an idea when he sees his knife that was thrown while fighting Madeline. Daryl then tries to provoke Winston by saying that after successfully killing him, he will take a photo of Winston and send it to Winston's mother. Winston realizes that Daryl knows his mother's address. Madeline then asks Winston if Moretti has any spies in the department. Winston replies that the only person he told about his mother's address was the judge when he made the witness protection report. Instantly, Madeline thought that there might be a Moretti insider in the police. Shortly after, Van Sant called Madeline and told her that she had sent help. Van Sant also said that the police had found the real Daryl, who had apparently been killed in his apartment. Madeline then asked Van Sant who else knew about Winston. Van Sant replied that only she and the judge knew about Winston. However, Van Sant adds that someone else could have accessed the information. Without realizing it, the plane they were traveling in almost crashed into a mountain. They panicked, and Madeline immediately pulled up the cockpit.
I'm telling you, it's fine.
However, because it was too late, the aircraft ended up crashing into the ice. Luckily, they only hit a pile of ice, so the plane could still fly back. However, the incident actually made Daryl happy because he liked the adrenaline sensation. Daryl is also happy because Madeline didn't kill her prisoner, Winston. Suddenly, Madeline was surprised that Daryl knew her past. From there, it is revealed that Madeline once got her prisoner killed, so she was finally dismissed from field duty. Daryl tries to play Winston's psychology, telling him to be careful and even persuading him to fight Madeline. Madeline goes straight to Daryl and asks who told him about her past while beating him up.
How do you know that?
What the same, you and me.
Apparently, Daryl knew a lot about Madeline's past. He kept talking to provoke Madeline's anger. Madeline beat Daryl again, until finally, Daryl managed to get Madeline's glasses, which he would use to open the rope that binds him. Meanwhile, Winston was terrified and asked Madeline to explain what Daryl had said. Madeline told the story that 2 years ago, she met a woman named Maria who had run away because she had fought her mobster boyfriend. There, Madeline violated security protocols by letting Maria take an unguarded shower. Then, suddenly, someone threw a Molotov cocktail into the bathroom and Maria was killed. Because of this incident, Madeline was dismissed from field duty. After telling her story, Madeline immediately contacted Van Sant and told her that the information leak had come from the office and that someone was spying. Van Sant immediately asked where Madeline could be sure of that. Madeline replied that Moretti's pilot knew all about her past. Then, Madeline asked what her leader, Coleridge, thought about this operation. Van Sant explained that Coleridge didn't know about it at all, and that Van Sant would be careful about giving information to anyone for fear that what Madeline had told her was true. Madeline immediately contacted Coleridge, but due to business, Coleridge could not be reached, and her call was answered by his assistant, Jenny. Madeline asked Jenny to notify Coleridge immediately, as it was an emergency. Not long after, Madeline finally managed to connect with Coleridge and immediately told him that Moretti had a spy in the head office, namely, Director Van Sant. Hearing that, Coleridge was silent and reminded Madeline that Van Sant had been helping her to get back into the field. Then, Coleridge tells Madeline to call him directly at his home number in Sankaty.
From now on, just call me directly at my house in Sankaty.
Not long after, they saw the beach. Madeline immediately contacted Hassan. Hassan directed Madeline to turn the aircraft slowly to the left and follow the coastline to the east.
Stunningly beautiful. Also, how's your fuel?
Suddenly, Madeline remembered Winston mentioning that he had bribed someone for $25,000 per month. Madeline asked where Winston had sent the money. Winston replied that he sent the money to someone's house in the Sankaty area.
Fuck.
What?
IP address in Sankaty, Massachusetts.
Holy shit.
On hearing this, Madeline immediately contacted Van Sant and said that Coleridge had leaked the operation. Madeline apologized for not trusting Van Sant earlier and instead contacted Coleridge out of suspicion of Van Sant. Madeline was very upset that her carelessness had made the case more complicated. Later, Madeline contacted Hassan again to inform him of her position so that help could arrive soon. At that time, Madeline told him that she had just passed the wreck of a ship called Fire Dancer. Not long after, Hassan reported that the rescue team had found out Madeline's location.
We've got a pretty good fix on your location.
Yeah?
Yes.
Without realizing it, Daryl had managed to untie the rope that bound him. He immediately stabbed Winston and strangled Madeline's neck.
You turned his color before? Huh?
But when Daryl was caught off guard, he was suddenly attacked by Winston until he bounced. Then, Daryl fired at Madeline, but no bullets hit her at all. Finally, Madeline managed to get a flare gun and shot Daryl immediately. After that, she beat Daryl repeatedly until Daryl finally lost consciousness. Seeing this, Madeline immediately rushed to treat Winston.
Listen to me, you're not dying. I'm gonna get you out of this, okay? You just gotta breathe.
A little later, Hassan contacted Madeline and asked how she was doing. Madeline informed him that Winston had been stabbed. Hassan immediately arranged for paramedics to rescue Winston. After that, Hassan informed her that in about 20 minutes, Madeline would be landing. Seeing Winston's increasingly worrying condition, Madeline asked for a way to make the plane arrive faster because she didn't want Winston to die. Hassan mentioned that Madeline could be faster, but the landing would be very difficult. Madeline was willing to take the risk and asked Hassan to tell her what to do. Hassan immediately directed Madeline to pull the lever to mix the fuel and push the throttle lever fully. Winston apologized for getting Madeline into trouble. In his dying state, Winston told Madeline that when he was in school, he was a very smart boy and could do anything. Winston said that he could have had a better job, but instead chose a dirty and risky one. Winston then asked Madeline to go to his mum's house to tell her that he had been doing good.
It would mean a lot to her. Please.
Moments later, Madeline calls Jenny to connect with Van Sant. However, it was Coleridge who picked up the phone. Madeline froze, thinking that something had happened to Van Sant. Coleridge then said that Van Sant had died after being hit by a car on her way out of the office. Suddenly, Madeline burst into hysterical tears and said that Coleridge had been working with Moretti.
No, it was you.
I'm not sure where you're going with this, Madeline.
25 grand a month?
You're going fucking
Fuck
crazy.
you! Careful!
Listen to
You be
me.
fucking careful!
Madeline was furious and promised to put Coleridge in jail. Shortly afterwards, Hassan called back and told her that Madeline would be landing soon. He asked Madeline to use headphones and turn the radio to a frequency of 121.5. Afterwards, Madeline tried to wake Winston, who looked very pale due to heavy blood loss. However, suddenly, from behind, Daryl, who was already conscious, asked why Madeline didn't kill him.
Because I'm not like you.
In a very desperate condition, Winston saw a relief plane that had arrived and directed them to land safely. Shortly after, Madeline can finally see the runway. It can be seen that Daryl keeps trying to open his handcuffs until his fingers are broken and his skin is peeled off.
Throttle to 25.
Finally, Daryl manages to free his hands from the handcuffs. He then immediately attacks Madeline and tries to fly the plane again because he doesn't want to be caught. Madeline, who had taken back her gun, without thinking, shot Daryl, leaving him lying on the ground. Hearing the gunshot, Hassan immediately asked about Madeline's condition because he was worried that something had happened to her. Madeline tells him that the plane's engine died because it ran out of fuel. However, Hassan said that this was good news because when Madeline landed, the aircraft would not catch fire easily. Hassan continued to direct Madeline. Then, knowing that Madeline was about to land, Hassan hung up the phone and said that he would meet her at the airport. The plane finally managed to land, but it experienced such a violent shock that Daryl was thrown out and eventually died. Madeline kept trying to control the plane and finally managed to land safely. She immediately woke Winston up and was very happy that Winston was still alive.
Yeah, we did.
Soon, the police arrived, and Madeline immediately ordered them to evacuate Winston. Finally, Madeline could rest assured that she had landed safely and on time so that the events of the past would not happen again. There, Madeline was awaited by Hassan, who seemed very happy that Madeline had landed safely. However, Madeline suddenly sees a policeman named Milko on the phone and then gets into the ambulance carrying Winston. Suddenly, Madeline ran straight to the ambulance. It appeared that Winston was going to be finished off, but Madeline immediately shot, and eventually, Milko died. Apparently, Milko was on the phone with Coleridge, who ordered him to finish Winston off immediately. Madeline immediately took Milko's mobile phone and told Coleridge that she would catch him soon.